Welcome to session 7 of our Bible survey course. It's so good to be able to work through the entire Bible together, and I continue to encourage you to be in touch with me if there are things about this Bible survey that you want to talk about or explore further, questions that you have, or concerns you want to raise, issues you want to talk about. Since we can't do this in person, I really miss the interaction, so I hope I'll get to hear from you. My name is Stephen Claiborne, and I am the senior pastor at Earl Street Baptist Church in Greenville, South Carolina. And like I said, we are working through the Bible survey course, and we are now on session 7. Covering the period of time that we call the divided monarchy, the Northern Kingdom. We'll be covering a span of about 200 years in this session, and the biblical material that we will be covering can be found in 1 Kings chapter 12 all the way through 2 Kings chapter 25, and then 2 of the so-called minor prophets of the Old Testament, the prophecy of Amos and the prophecy of Hosea. We'll be, if you want to follow along on the outline, we'll be looking at pages 15 and 16 in the study guide, which can be found on our website, which is esbcgreenville.org. And on that website, you can also find the videos of the previous sessions. Just click on the resources tab and then the Bible survey tab, and you should be able to find it. Well, today we pick up with the period of time when the United Monarchy divided. Last time we covered the first 3 kings of Israel. Prior to the time of the monarchy, the people of God were ruled by judges, but there was no central leader. And so with the reign of Saul, who was Israel's first king, and then Saul was replaced by King David, and then David was replaced by Solomon, David's son. Those were the glory days of Israel. But of course, success always has its price. And Solomon's glory came at the expense of the people. He had increased taxation and had imposed forced labor to support his building programs. And so the kingdom flourished in some ways, but it was kind of at the expense of the forced labor of the citizens of the kingdom. And Solomon, because of his popularity and all of his splendor and glory, was able to get by with it. But as we ended last week, Solomon died, and when he died, many of the people who had been dissatisfied with Solomon seized the opportunity to let their voices be known. This is the way it is. It's just human dynamics that when there is a leadership vacuum, people kind of rise up to the surface to fill it. Sometimes we see this in churches where somebody puts up with a pastor, but then as soon as the pastor leaves, then they let their voices be heard. Well, upon Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam assumed the throne. And so this continues the dynastic kingdom of David. Remember, the Lord made a covenant with David that his kingdom would never end. So when David died, his son became king. And his son was Solomon. And then when Solomon died, his son assumed that he would be king, Rehoboam. But when Rehoboam went to the northern tribes to be crowned, they requested that he ease up on them and not deal as harshly with them as his father had. They had been silent all during the time of Solomon. But they saw this as an opportunity to make some demands on Rehoboam. But Rehoboam not only refused their request, but he vowed to bear down even harder than his father Solomon had. And so that set in motion the division of the United Monarchy into the northern and southern kingdom. The northern 10 tribes, when Rehoboam refused to grant their requests, the northern 10 tribes withdrew and chose their own king. And then once, so the once united kingdom was divided, really never to be completely united again. Well, the kingdom was divided into the north and the south. Israel was the name that was given to the northern 10 tribes, ruled by Jeroboam the first. And the northern 10 tribes were stronger, but had a more unstable government. The southern 2 tribes were ruled by Rehoboam, and we'll get to them in just a second. But the northern 10 tribes, ruled by Jeroboam the first, who became kind of the leader of that rebellion against Rehoboam. By almost any standard, the northern kingdom gained an advantage over Judah. It was stronger economically. It had a larger population. It controlled the major roads, and it really had the best and most productive land. So the only disadvantage was the instability of its government. Whereas the southern kingdom still was ruled by the promise that God gave to David that his kingdom would last forever. So David's kingdom became a dynastic kingdom, whereas the northern kingdom was much more unstable. There was no sure way to move from one king to another in the northern kingdom, as we will see. The southern kingdom, Judah, had 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and the southern kingdom was ruled by Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, who perpetuated the dynasty that David had established. And next week, we'll be talking about the history of the southern kingdom. But Judah had some advantages too. Judah had the capital city of Jerusalem, which had become a really important asset because Jerusalem was the home of the temple, the elaborate temple that Solomon built, the house of God, the unique place of God's presence. And of course, central in the temple was the Ark of the Covenant. And as I mentioned, the southern 2 tribes had the advantage of the Davidic monarchy, which assured stability. There was never any question about who would be the next king when the previous king died. So today we're going to look at the history of the northern kingdom, beginning with Israel's first king, Jeroboam the first, who ruled from 922 to 901 BC. Jeroboam set up worship centers at Dan and Bethel, the northern and southern points of Israel's boundaries, as kind of counterparts to Jerusalem, to rival Jerusalem. So remember, the advantage that the southern kingdom had was that they had Jerusalem where the temple was. So Jeroboam was smart enough to realize that he had to set up some worship centers in Israel, and so he did at the northern and southernmost parts of Israel, in Dan and Beersheba. I mean, not Dan and Bethel. Jeroboam, though, also, even though he was smart enough to set up those worship centers, he used golden calves to replace the Ark of the Covenant. And golden calves were symbols of Canaanite religion. And so you can already see at the very beginning of the Northern Kingdom's history, there was this syncretism, this blend between the religion of the one true God and Canaanite religion as well. Well, Jeroboam I was replaced by Nadab, who ruled a very short time. Jeroboam I, Nadab was the son of Jeroboam I, so it looks like the Northern Kingdom is going to establish a dynasty as well, but that dynasty was very much short-lived. Nadab, as you can see, only ruled about a year, and he was murdered, and he was murdered and succeeded by Baasha. So here a pattern is established that the way you get to be king is murder the existing king. Well, Baasha ruled from 900 to 877, and he decided that it was going to be important for him to end the dynasty once and for all, Jeroboam's dynasty. So he murdered the rest of Jeroboam's family. He was a very successful military leader, and he died of natural causes. Well, when he died, he was replaced by Elah, who ruled a very short time, and Elah was Baasha's son. So again, it looks like now maybe a new dynasty is being formed, but Elah was murdered and succeeded by Zimri. Now, Zimri probably holds the record of having the shortest reign. He only reigned 7 days, and he burned the palace down upon himself, and his suicide was provoked by an attack by Omri. So Omri became the next king. Zimri felt the walls closing in on him as Omri was attacking, so Zimri just put an end to it all. Well, he was replaced by Omri, who ruled from 876 to 869, and Omri moved quickly to organize his kingdom along the lines of the Davidic and Solomonic kingdoms. Omri kind of learned from the success of David and Solomon and tried to pattern some of his reign after their success. First, he sealed an alliance with Phoenicia by the marriage of his son Ahab to Jezebel. We'll see how that played out. But he was trying to negotiate and make alliances with foreign powers. Phoenicia had been so profitable to David and Solomon, but that marriage between Ahab and Jezebel would have far-reaching effects upon Israelite society and religion, as we will see. And then using the materials gathered from his alliance with the Phoenicians, he began extensive building programs, which is also similar to the kingdoms of David and Solomon. He also moved the capital from Tirzah to the hill of Samaria, and Samaria became the capital of the northern tribes of Israel until Israel was no more. And then he established the longest dynasty in the history of the Northern Kingdom, 34 years, from 876 to 842. Now, as I mentioned, he was replaced by his son, Ahab, who ruled from 869 to 850. And as I have already mentioned, Ahab married Jezebel, who was an ardent worshiper of the Canaanite god Baal. And Jezebel worshipped Canaanite gods. So Ahab built altars to Baal and made an idol to represent Asherah, who was Baal's mistress, as you might recall from our session when we previewed Canaanite religion. And in the court alone, there were 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. So you can see that when Ahab became king, largely because of the influence of Jezebel, he not only let Canaanite religion infiltrate the kingdom, but he also sanctioned it and allowed it to flourish. And because of Canaanite religion's sexual attraction, and because of Jezebel's promotion of it, Baalism, or Canaanite religion, threatened to sweep over the land, and probably would have, had it not been for one man, the prophet Elijah, who stemmed the tide. Elijah was the first prophet who could be really ranked among the great prophets. In fact, Elijah became kind of the prototype of the prophets. You might remember, if you fast forward into the New Testament, on the Mount of Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah appeared with Jesus on the mountain. Moses representing the law, Elijah representing the prophets. Well, a prophet in Hebrew culture was a spokesperson. The general term, Hebrew word nabi is the word for prophet, usually refers to someone who had experienced a vocation or a divine call, someone who was an independent, religious, and charismatic figure who had no hereditary claim to the office nor the benefit of a politician's appointment. This was someone who was completely independent, not appointed by a politician, therefore did not have any particular political loyalties. A prophet was one who was willing to speak truth to power and was not primarily what we might often think of when we think of prophets. We might think of someone who predicts the future. But a prophet was not so much a predictor. A prophet was one who was gifted by God to kind of size up or interpret the present. And any predictions which came from the prophet really were based on his perception of the present circumstances of the people. A prophet was one who constantly called the people back to the terms of the covenant. Prophets were judged to be authentic or false on the basis of two criteria. One is, was the prophetic prediction fulfilled? If a prophet predicted something, if that prediction came true, then after the fact, the people were willing to validate the prophet. And also, if the prophet's message was consistent with the terms of the covenant that had already been established by God. None of the true prophets enjoyed popularity. Most of them were not even recognized as true prophets until after the fact, when the people of God looked back and said, you know, Elijah was right. Their lives and their messages were often vindicated only after their death. Well, there was that famous contest on Mount Carmel. It's a really fascinating story that you can read in 1 Kings 18, when it kind of just became this showdown between the prophets of Baal and Elijah, and there was this contest. And of course, Elijah's God, Yahweh, the one true God, won that contest. If you want to open your Bible to 1 Kings 18, you can see some of this playing out. We obviously don't have the time to read all 46 verses, but if you pick up in chapter 18 of 1 Kings, beginning with verse 20, you see, so Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel, and Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you go limping with two different opinions? If the Lord is God, if Yahweh is God, then follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. And the people did not answer a word. Then Elijah said, even I only am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. And then, so there came that showdown. If we skip over to verse 36, at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you are God, that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. And then with that prayer, the fire of the Lord fell, this is verse 38, and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, Yahweh, he is God. Yahweh, he is God. And Elijah said to them, okay, then seize the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. And they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and killed them all there. It's a pretty dramatic end to this of this contest in which the Lord proved himself, and then Elijah got rid of all these prophets of Baal who were influencing the people in such an evil way. Well, Ahab was succeeded by his son Ahaziah. And during his reign, I'm sorry, I lost my place. During his reign, Elijah was taken up by a whirlwind into heaven. And when that happened, Elijah's cloak was left behind for Elisha, symbolizing the role of Elijah's successor. Elisha was more of a public figure and a political activist than Elijah was. He belonged to and worked with a group of prophets known as the sons of the prophets. These were prophets who lived together in communal societies, and many miracle stories are told about Elisha. You might want to take the time to look up some of these. The cursing of the small children who called him Baldy, 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. Let's just go ahead and read that one simply because of its comedic elements. Elisha went up from, this is 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. Elisha went up from there to Bethel, and while he was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go up, you bald head. Go up, you bald head." And he turned around, and when he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. From there, he went on to Mount Carmel, and thence he returned to Samaria. I guess the moral of that story is don't be calling God's prophets names. It won't work out well for you. And then, you know, there's the miracle story of Elisha bringing the son back to life in 2 Kings chapter 4. And then one of the stories that was that I learned as a child, the healing of Naaman's leprosy as he dipped 7 times and was cleansed. And then the floating axe head. in 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. The point is that Elisha was used by God in miraculous ways. Not only was he a prophet who spoke the truth, but he was also a miracle worker through the power of God. Well, he was succeeded by Jehoram, sometimes called Joram, who ruled from 849 to 842, and he was the last of Omri's dynasty. He was the son of Shaziah. Elisha chose Jehu to be king of Israel and commissioned him to destroy the family of Ahab. And Jehu's army unit supported him and proclaimed him king while Jehoram was still reigning. So Elisha chose Jehu to be the successor of Jehoram or Joram, and chose him while Jehoram or Joram was still reigning. And of course, Joram took a dim view of that. Well, Jehu killed Jehoram. Jehu also killed Jezebel and all the relatives and close friends and advisors of Ahab. And then he pretended that he was a Baal worshiper and called a meeting of all the Baal worshipers. And when they were all gathered together, he killed all of them too. And this came to be known as the bloody purge of Jehu. And it paved the way for the northern kingdom's most glorious days. Now, granted, Jehu got rid of Canaanite religion by violence, but he did get rid of Canaanite religion, which kind of purged the land of the influence of Canaanite religion. Well, his son succeeded him, Jehoahaz, and Jehoahaz ruled from 815 to 801. But he was taken advantage of by the Syrians and was basically reduced by the Syrians to a military weakling. Well, his son, Jehoash, succeeded him and ruled from 801 to 786. He was a bit more successful than his father, and it was during his reign that Elisha died. Then from 786 to 746, Jeroboam II ruled. Jeroboam II was the son of Jehoash. And Jeroboam II ruled over a really successful period of time. It was during his reign that Israel had her last burst of prosperity. And during his reign, when combined with Judah, Israel extended its limits to those achieved during the days of David and Solomon. So expanded the borders of the northern kingdom as well. Israel and Judah, during this period of time, as we will see next week when we talk about the southern kingdom, were both prospering again, and everything seemed to be going well in the north and the south until the prophets Amos and Hosea came on the scene and brought their word from the Lord. We'll get to them in a moment. Well, Jeroboam II was succeeded by his son, Zechariah, who ruled a very short time. He was assassinated within 6 months by Shallum, who became the king and also ruled a very short time, only 1 month, because he was assassinated by Menahem. And it was during this time that the Assyrian Empire began to expand, both in terms of its geographical limits, but also expand in terms of its military strength. And Assyria will become a power to be reckoned with at the end, as Israel nears the end of its history. It was around this time that Tiglath-Pileser III in Assyria, who ruled from 746 to 727, came into power, and after conquering the Babylonians, he invaded the Syrian city-states in 743, and by 738, they were already paying heavy tribute to him. So we're starting to see now, as early as 745, that Assyria is starting to infiltrate the northern kingdom and requiring taxation or paying heavy tributes. So Israel was failing internally and externally. Well, Shallum was replaced by Menahem, who surrendered to the armies of Tiglath-Pileser and paid a heavy bribe to keep Assyria from destroying the country. And some who opposed Menahem's kingship had their cities attacked by Menahem's armies. So Menahem turned Israel's own armies against herself. And there's a brutal, gruesome story in 2 Kings 15, 13 through 16 of the stomachs of their pregnant women being cut open. Anybody who dared to oppose Menahem was treated in that violent way. Well, Menahem was succeeded by his son, Pekahiah, who was assassinated by Pekah, who succeeded him. And Pekah, during his reign, the Assyrians actually attacked the northern kingdom of Israel, and Pekah tried to stir up a rebellion against Assyria and was supported actually in that effort by Rezin, the king of Syria. But when Ahaz, who happened to be his contemporary in the south, the king of Judah, refused to join the alliance, Pekah and Rezin threatened to invade Judah and put their own king on the throne of Judah. And in fact, an attack was made in 734, but was unsuccessful. Judah made concessions to Assyria at that time and was spared, but Israel was little by little being absorbed by and destroyed by Assyria. In 734, Tiglath-Pileser reduced Israel to a few square miles of territory in the central hill country surrounding Samaria. In 732, he destroyed Damascus, which was the capital of Syria, not Assyria, and killed Rezin and added Syria to his empire. And then Pekah was murdered by Hoshea in 732. Until the death of Tiglath-Pileser in 727, Hoshea played the role of an obedient servant to Assyria. And Hoshea kind of figured out that the only way we're going to survive this is if we cave in to the demands of Assyria. But upon the death of Tiglath-Pileser, Hoshea appealed to Egypt for help in rebelling against Assyria, but Egypt at this time was not able to be of any help. Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria was succeeded by Shalmaneser V in 727, from 727 to 722. And in 725, his army struck the capital city of Samaria and set up a siege around the city. It took the Assyrian armies 3 years to capture the city, but in 722-21, with the fall of Samaria, the northern kingdom of Israel disappeared, never to rise again. The biblical narrator interpreted the fall of Israel as being the inevitable result of forsaking the covenant with the Lord, and the prophets Amos and Hosea would concur. I've been through kind of all of this detailed history just to kind of show you the pattern that the Northern Kingdom had a very unstable form of government, and that the Northern Kingdom really did invite its own demise by introducing Canaanite religion and endorsing Canaanite religion, in addition to their faith in Yahweh, the one true God. Well, we're going to look at two of the prophets to the Northern Kingdom quickly. The first was Amos. Amos was born in Tekoa, not Tekoa, Georgia, but Tekoa, Judah, 10 miles south of Jerusalem in the Central Hill Country, not far from the Dead Sea. He was considered a shepherd, literally a pincher of sycamore figs. We would say a migrant worker, probably poor, probably illiterate. His messages use imagery which reflects his background. He denied association with the professional prophets. He was a forceful, uncompromising, often fearless, and sometimes angry prophet. Well, he was prophesying in the northern 10 tribes of Israel, though he himself was from the south. So here's a southerner coming up north, prophesying from Bethel, where one of the royal sanctuaries was in the northern kingdom, from which he would be later expelled. He had a very brief prophecy around 750 BC during the reign of Jeroboam II. Now remember, from what I just said, it's very important to realize that during Jeroboam II's second reign, it was a very peaceful reign, probably more stability during the rule of Jeroboam II than at any other time in Israel's history. And as I mentioned, Israel had reached a height of territorial expansion and national prosperity, never again reached in her history. It was a time of materialism. It was a time of luxury for many, but there was social injustice. The poor could not find justice in the marketplaces or in the courts. There was a time of moral depravity. It was a sick society. The rich were getting richer, but the poor were getting poorer. And even though it was a morally depraved society, it was also a religious society. There was a lot of religious activity and ritual. And the prosperity, financial prosperity that Israel enjoyed during Jeroboam II's reign was interpreted by Israel as the Lord's favor. So the assumption was that they were prospering because the Lord was smiling upon them and blessing them. But it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. The rich were getting richer. Depending on who you ask, they would say, this is the best time we've ever had. But at the same time, the poor were getting poorer and we're not getting justice in this prosperity. Well, Amos comes on the scene with his message, and his message was the justice of God. And he begins in chapter 1 by pronouncing oracles first against Israel's neighbors. And he would always begin with the formula for 3 transgressions and for 4, he would say, which was a figurative way of insinuating the complete sinfulness of each nation. 3 transgressions would be considered a completely sinful group, but then he would add a 4th, which meant even more sinful than sinful. For 3 transgressions and for 4, the Lord says, I will not revoke the punishment. So he begins with an oracle against Damascus in chapter 1, verses 3 through 5, and then Philistia in verses 6 through 8, and then Tyre in verses 9 through 10, then against Edom in verses 11 through 12, and then against Ammon in verses 13 through 15, then against Moab in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, and then against Judah in chapter 2, verses 4 through 5. And the whole time he's preaching, I'm sure the people of Israel were saying, preach it against Damascus and Philistia and Tyre and Edom and Ammon and Moab and Judah. Give it to them, Amos. And then he got to Israel, and his oracle against Israel was the longest of these oracles. Look at chapter 2 of Amos, verses 6 through 8. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of shoes. They that trample the head of the poor in the dust of the earth and turn aside the way of the afflicted. A man and his father go into the same maiden, so that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar upon garments taken in pledge, and in the house of their God they drink the wine of those who have been fined. So first, Amos sets the tone for his prophecy by pronouncing judgment, first against Israel's neighbors and then against Israel herself. And then Amos talks about Israel's sinfulness and God's punishment. And you see this in chapters 3 through 6. And each of these sections begins with the words, hear this word. In chapter 3, he talks about the privileges and responsibilities of being elected as God's people. In chapter 4, if you look at chapter 4, verse 1, he says, hear this word, you cows of Bashan who are in the mountain of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to their husbands, bring that we may drink. And then in chapters 5 through 6, he talks about the certainty and horror of Israel's punishment. If you look at chapter 5, verses 21 through 24, some of the most famous verses in Amos, where the Lord says through the prophet Amos, I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and cereal offerings, I will not accept them, and the peace offerings of your fatted beasts I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs, to the melody of your harps I will not listen, but let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Remember, I said that during this time, it was a very religious time, but the Lord was saying, I am sickened by your expressions of religion, because your ethics and your morals betray the faith that you claim to have. And then in chapters 7 through 9, we see visions. Amos gives us visions of Israel's doom, and then Israel's restoration. We see in chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, a vision of judgment by locusts. Chapter 7, verses 4 through 6, a vision of judgment by fire. Verses 7 through 9, vision of judgment by a plumb line, where the Lord holds a plumb line to show how what is the moral straightness of God's law, and how the people of God were not in line with that. And then a basket of ripe summer fruit in chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. Amos pictures this basket of ripe summer fruit that is about to ruin. And then the vision of God ordering that the capitals be destroyed. And we see that in chapter 9, verses 1 through 4. And finally, he ends his prophecy in chapter 9, verses 11 through 15. After all of these visions of doom, he ends the chapter with a vision of the restoration of the Davidic dynasty. Remember now, the Davidic dynasty is what is going on in the southern kingdom. And so he holds out this vision that after all of this doom and judgment by God, that God is going to restore the kingdom of David. Amos was a harsh character, harsh prophet who didn't mind speaking the truth and didn't mind offending people either. Well, let's take a moment as we close to look at the other prophet to the southern kingdom, and that is the prophet Hosea. Hosea was a citizen of the northern kingdom whose very life and family became a metaphor or an analogy for the Lord's relationship with Israel. He prophesied to the northern kingdom following closely the prophecy of Amos, somewhere between 750 and 735. Again, at a time when the peace and prosperity began to turn to chaos and virtual anarchy. The historical background is essentially the same as the setting of Amos's prophecy, except Hosea continued to prophesy after Jeroboam's death in 746, when the peace and prosperity that characterized Jeroboam II's reign turned to chaos. And so Hosea watched as almost overnight the kingdom began to disintegrate both internally and externally with the Assyrian threat. After the death of Jeroboam II, Israel suffered from the war with Assyria and was in virtual anarchy. So that time of prosperity came to a close, and it was followed by anarchy and destruction. Well, Hosea's message in a nutshell was the Hebrew word chesed, which means faithful, loyal, steadfast love, covenant love, redeeming love. Hosea's relationship with his family exemplified Yahweh's relationship with Israel. If you look at chapters 1 through 3, you see that his wife Gomer was a harlot, and then Jezreel was a son whose name refers back to Jehu's bloody purge, and then another son, Lo Ruhamah, which literally meant not pitied, not a son, I'm sorry, a daughter, whose name referred to the coming judgment of the Lord by the Assyrian army, who would show Israel no pity. So he named his daughter Lo Ruhamah, not pitied. And then Lo Ami, who was a son, and Lo Ami literally means not my people. And so this son became a symbol of the fact that the Lord would no longer claim Israel as his people. So Hosea was married to a harlot. He had these children whose names symbolized how God was going to relate to the people in the northern kingdom. And the prophet Hosea came to speak a word of hope, that the day would come when the message of the children's names would be changed. And in that day, instead of the Lord saying to Israel, "You are not my people," he would call them Ami, my people. Instead of saying to Israel, "You are not pitied," he would remove the word lo, which in Hebrew means no or not, and say to them, "You are pitied." And Jezreel's name would one day be restored as a place of joy and not destruction. In chapter 2, the prophet calls on his children to plead with their mother to change her ways. In chapter 3, Hosea buys Gomer back from a life of prostitution and restores her as his wife only after she undergoes a period of probation. And the point was, as Hosea was living out his own personal history, his personal history became an analogy of the relationship that God had with God's people. The point was that Israel, like Gomer, had forsaken her first loyalty, and Yahweh, like Hosea, would buy her back and redeem her. And then chapters 4 through 14 were just straight up prophetic oracles. So the first 3 chapters are kind of a description of Hosea's personal life, but the last 10 or 11 chapters were just straight up the messages of Hosea, the denunciation of pride, and idolatry and corruption. Let's look at chapter 6, verse 6 of Hosea, where Hosea is quoting the Lord and says, I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. This sounds very similar to the passage from Amos that we read earlier, where the Lord said, I despise your feasts. What the Lord wants is not religious ritual, but a genuine relationship. And in these oracles, if you look at chapter 4, verse 1, Hosea says, hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or kindness and no knowledge of God in the land. And that is the contention that God had with the people during this time. There is no faithfulness or kindness and no knowledge of God in the land. Hosea predicted the approaching punishment of the northern kingdom. And then in chapter 11, verse 1, he predicts the triumph of Chesed, God's steadfast love. And he says, when Israel was a child, this is the Lord speaking through Hosea, chapter 11, verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And the more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning incense to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of compassion, with the bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them. A real tender picture of God's love for Israel, even in the face of Israel's rebellion against the Lord. So Amos and Hosea appear during the time of Jeroboam II and the time immediately following Jeroboam II to pronounce a twofold message, one of doom and one of hope, that the Lord will judge them, but the Lord will also restore and redeem them. Well, next session, we're going to be looking at the same period of time and beyond what was going on in the southern kingdom at the time all of this was going on in the northern kingdom. And we will read about that in 2 Chronicles 10 through 36, and then several of the Old Testament prophets, the first 39 chapters of Isaiah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Jeremiah, and Zephaniah. A lot of material to read or scan before the next session. And we'll talk about the southern kingdom whenever we come back together. I hope you'll stick with me, and I hope I'll get to see you or hear from you soon.